Hallo, hallo und guten Abend. Im Namen der Massillon Museum es ist meine Freude, Sie herzlich willkommen. I have heard enough French tonight. I'm David Schultz. I'm a trustee of the Massillon Museum and have been for many years. I'm pleased to welcome all of you tonight on behalf of the museum staff and the Museum Board of Trustees to a very, very special evening. There will be a book signing following the panel discussion tonight, and we'll continue to make copies of the book available for sale. I'd like to introduce now the person who's going to be our host for the evening, and that's Maureen. Maureen, who is better known to our friends as Mo, is the general manager of the Independent, my alma mater. And she's been there since August of 2013, and she's overseeing day-to-day operations at the Independent. And when she's not doing that, she's a board member of the YMCA of Stark County, the County District Library, Artful Living, the Ahead Foundation, Goodwill Industries of Greater Cleveland and East Central. She's a recipient of the Canton JC's Distinguished Service Award, and she'll be chairing the repository's bicentennial initiative in March. Believe it or not, she has 2 children and another one on the way, in spite of all that community activity. She's quite an accomplished lady, and I'm very, very pleased to invite Maureen. At the end of our Q&A, which Maureen's going to conduct, John McGrath and I will be assisting her with the Q&A. Maureen, it's all yours from here.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for coming out on such a cold night. We're going to have a wonderful evening, an exciting evening. It's got to be exciting because many of you just came from a wonderful dinner where we may have had a few glasses of wine and then came in from the cold into a warm theater. So no sleeping, no matter how much you feel like you're so comfortable. We do have a wonderful evening planned where we are celebrating Massillon Connection, a pioneer woman, a French bishop, and a village on a river. Who out here is a Massillon fan? Now, who out here is a Massillon fan? We'll all be Massillon fans by the end of this. So before we introduce our initial speakers, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. As David mentioned, we are going to leave time at the end for Q&A. We strongly encourage you to ask questions. We have an absolutely wonderful panel of experts. They would love to be able to answer whatever questions you might have, and we'll have microphones in the aisles stationed there so you can step down, ask your question at the end. We want to make sure that you have had a chance to purchase a book or receive a book if you were at the dinner. Books will be for sale if you haven't gotten them at the back of the theater, and then at the very end we're going to have book signing out in the lobby. So let's begin. We want to introduce our first speakers, and I'll be introducing together to the stage first Dr. Charles Paclet, MD. He's a retired orthopedic surgeon and lifetime resident of Massillon. He's responsible for spearheading the Massillon Connection in an effort to preserve our city's history for generations to come. Dr. Paclet. We also have Tricia Merchant, a resident of Massillon for many years, was a high school French teacher, and taught in France as a Fulbright Scholar in 2001-2002. Dr. Paclet and Tricia will be giving us kind of an overview, an introduction of how this project came to be, and then later we'll be bringing up our panelists to the stage. So take it away.
The mission of the Massillon Museum is to promote the arts and preserve the history of Massillon, and in so doing, improves the life and the quality of life of the citizens of Massillon and makes Massillon a better place to live, to work, and to do business. Our book, the Massillon Connection, a pioneer woman, a French bishop, and a village on the river represents the definitive account of the founding and naming of our town. It is a signature project of the museum's mission to preserve the history of Massillon. This project has been fully funded. Donations have not been solicited and none have been accepted. No taxpayer dollars or public monies have been used in this endeavor. Furthermore, this project has not been designed to produce an income for any individual or for the museum. It is truly a public service project. Copies of this book will be given to area schools, universities, libraries, and museums. Interested individuals and others may purchase copies at cost. However, it is thought that the goodwill and interest this book produces will cause some people to pay more attention to the museum and those with the means to make significant financial contributions to the museum. Now, cities, towns, and villages in the United States are named for different reasons. The American Indians gave names to some communities that persist to this day. Others have been named for their geographical location or maybe some associated geological formation. Some are named for an historical event. Some are named for a distant place of some importance to those choosing the name. And believe it or not, some are just whimsical. And finally, some are named for a personality, which is our case. The local books on the history of Massillon identify Bishop Massillon as our namesake and Eliza Duncan, wife of our town's founder, James Duncan, responsible for choosing the name. But they see a little more than Bishop Massillon was a French bishop famous for his sermons, and Eliza Duncan may have been of French heritage and was able to speak French. The pages of this book will further define the Duncan family, Bishop Massillon, and explain once and for all how it is our town acquired the name of Massillon. The idea of writing this book was taken first to the Massillon Museum and then later the Massillon Public Library, where it was enthusiastically received. A committee of board members was formed to explore the feasibility of such a project. Because of the complexities of writing an historical manuscript was new territory for many of us, we chose to expand our group to include those that had expertise in education or literature, and some that just had an intense interest in Massillon. We eventually attracted some 20 or 30 individuals with varying degrees of interest and participation. Membership in our group was neither inclusive nor exclusive. It was more by chance. We just happened to think of you, or you just happened to show up. Over time, some came and went, and others persisted. The writing of this book took a long time, a very long time, an agonizingly long time. However, this process, as slow as it's been, was not all bad. Because of the time frame and the diversity of the participants, some really good ideas surfaced to improve the format of the book. We wanted our book to be easily understood and read by the average person, and entrusted its composition to two aspiring students of history. Mr. Andrew Preston would write about the Duncans, and Ms. Katina Zimahalis would do the same for Bishop Massillon. Now, there is only a limited amount of data available for any historical research. We are satisfied that our investigation in these matters has been as thorough and as complete as possible. The American Revolution ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, but hostilities with England didn't really end. They just took a different form. The British continued to agitate the Indians along our frontier. Punitive taxes on American goods destined for European ports remained in place, and the British Navy harassed our merchantmen at sea. Those and other aggressive actions eventually led to the War of 1812. And during that time, the maritime economy of this newly formed republic was in shambles, and many seafaring families looked afar for other opportunities, and many came to the Northwest Territory, a part of which had become the recently formed state of Ohio. Thomas and Charity Rodge were two such early settlers. In 1811, they founded the village of Kendall on the Sippo Creek near the Tuscarawas River. James and Eliza Duncan soon followed. This newlywed couple came to Kendall in 1816, just 5 years after its founding, to raise sheep and develop the land. They soon found themselves involved in the building of the Ohio and Erie Canal, a canal that would transform Ohio into a political and economic power. In exchange for the canal passing through his land, Duncan gave a portion of his land to be made into a port along the canal, and his wife is given credit for choosing its name. Why she chose Massillon is uncertain. Originally it was thought she was of French heritage, and now we know that is unlikely. However, we do have reason to believe it was through her education in French culture and French literature and the French language that she became familiar with Massillon. Was Massillon simply a word that musically rolled off her tongue when a suitable name was required? Unless a diary is found in a forgotten trunk in a distant relative's attic, we'll never likely know the true genesis of that choice. The Duncans benefited greatly from the prosperity the canal brought to this area, only to see their wealth disappear with the collapse of the financial markets they helped create. In 1848, some 32 years after having come to this area, they left Massillon to recover their losses, this time in the newly found copper mines in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. They spent nearly 15 years in the Upper Peninsula near Marquette developing their mining interest. And while they're often visited with two of their daughters literally living side by side in Chicago, Illinois. James died in 1863 at the age of 74 in the home of his daughter, Mary Reynolds. He is buried in the Reynolds family plot in Graceland Cemetery, Chicago. Eliza then moved amongst her daughters and eventually found herself living in Manhattan, New York City. She died in 1878 at the age of 82 in the home of her daughter, Sarah Eli. She is buried in Greenwood Cemetery, Brooklyn, New York. Bishop Massillon was active during the reign of Louis XIV, 1643 to 1715, when France was at its zenith. France was a social, political, economic, and military power. It was a superpower. Paris was the place to be. The French court was the most splendid in all Christendom. It was the most ostentatious, elegant, grandiose the Western world had ever seen, and its excesses were viewed by many as moral decadence. At that time, France was emerging from a series of unpopular wars and still shook from the Protestant Reformation. Massillon was a charismatic preacher and a gifted orator. He avoided the theological issues associated with the Protestant Reformation and rather concerned himself with social and moral issues and general principles of Christianity. He may be compared to the 20th century American evangelist, the Reverend Billy Graham, for his oft-times uncomfortable message and influence on the times. He was often invited to speak before the French court, and in so doing, walked a fine line between exhorting his noble audience to deep inward spiritual renewal and provoking indignation with eventual censure and expulsion from the pulpit at the court. His sermons were of such a high standard, he was elected to the French Academy, the preeminent literary society composed of 40 members, the so-called 40 immortals that define French literature. The Academy goes on to this day and includes such notables as Voltaire and Victor Hugo. At the time of this writing, there is an astounding 1,300 copies of Massillon's sermons and other works in at least 5 languages for sale on the internet. This alone gives some idea about the popularity and staying power of Bishop Massillon. Because Massillon was famous for his sermons, we thought it appropriate to reproduce one. We have chosen arguably his most famous sermon, entitled On the Fewness of the Elect, otherwise known as Why So Few Are Saved. This sermon was written over 300 years ago in French, designed to appeal to an audience with perhaps a different temperament than ours. This sermon, unlike present-day sermons, is lengthy. If read aloud, it takes a week. We revised an 1818 English translation by William Dickinson. No easy matter. 18th century English is about as close to a foreign language as one can get and not be one. We were careful not to change the meaning of the sermon and compared our revision to the original French and found it to be accurate. Furthermore, we tried to maintain the flowery, complicated, and sometimes convoluted style favored by Massillon. Now, in this sermon, Massillon describes two groups of people destined for heaven or worthy of salvation. The first group are those that are pure and clean, that is, those who have never sinned, of which there are very, very, very few. And then the other group, those that have sinned, like everybody in this theater, but have since repented and then lived an exemplary Christian life. And he goes to great lengths to describe what he means by repentance and an exemplary Christian life. Now he sets the bar very high, very, very high. And I can tell you, the three of us that spent many hours laboring over this sermon are absolutely convinced we three are going to hell. This effort, that began as a local project and extended nationally and internationally. We're particularly indebted to Claude Girard, Professor of History at the Sorbonne, Paris, France, Douglas Palmer, Associate Professor of History, Walsh University, and the Reverend Thomas E. Blance, Professor of History at the University of Notre Dame. Also, the staff of the Massillon Public Library and the staff of the Massillon Museum have been extraordinarily helpful in this effort. And finally, the 20 or so Massillonians, citizens of Massillon, your friends and neighbors, that met over a 7-year period, frequently, sometimes not so frequently, occasionally, sometimes not so occasionally, regularly and sometimes not so regularly, to make this book possible. The persistence that they showed speaks loudly about the passion they have for their town. We like to think Massillon plays bigger than it really is, that we have an esprit de corps not found in most communities. Some think it's all about football, a game that brings us together. Our Massillon High School football team is locally famous. It has a national identity, and its Obie mascot is the most recognizable high school logo in the nation. Who would have thought a compassionate 18th century French bishop who spoke so fervently on Christian ideals would lend his name to a football team, the Massillon Tigers? Thank you.
The title of our book, The Massillon Connection, of course, talks about the connection between Jean-Baptiste Massillon and Eliza Duncan. But beyond that, along the way, we have made other connections, and we'd like to share some of those connections with you tonight. Because of our contact with and correspondence with people in Hyères, France, where Massillon was from, we were invited in early 2013 to go to the city and help them celebrate the 350th anniversary of the birth of Massillon. thanks to Dr. Packley, it was not at all difficult to decide to go to the south of France in November. This was the view, this was our first view of the Mediterranean from the terrace of the president of the Hyères Historical and Archaeological Society. He invited us and a group of their members to his home for a reception on our first afternoon there. Hyères is a city of about 20,000. It's a very old town. It was originally founded by the Greeks. Later, the Romans lived there, and there are ruins of both those civilizations in the area. This is the group that went from right to left. Josh and Alex Kuhn, Dr. Charlie and Judy Packley, moi, et Massillon. Hyères is a port city, and particularly in the summer, there are, of course, many boats and a number of really large yachts. It's very much a tourist city, and really very lovely, very quaint. The climate is tropical, very much like southern Florida. The largest square in town is the Place Massillon, and here you can see the Church of Saint-Paul, where Massillon was baptized and where his baptismal certificate can still be seen. Especially on Sundays, but on pretty much every nice day, the square is a very busy place. Many restaurants serve out there, and it's a popular gathering place. From a little bit above the square, here we're looking out across the city to the Mediterranean in the distance. And the red tiled roofs of the houses in Provence are very typical of the area. I would imagine many of these homes have been inhabited for hundreds of years. The French build their homes to last. And while they generally update the interiors and have Wi-Fi and everything that they might need, the outside almost always looks exactly like it did when it was built. This statue of Massillon is at one end of the square, and it was dedicated in 1960, the 300th anniversary of Massillon. It was actually built to replace the original bronze statue, which in 1942 was melted down by the Nazis to use for armaments. Off of the Place Massillon is the Porte Massillon, the Massillon Gate, and it leads directly to the Rue Massillon. There are many businesses along the way named for the man. Poissonnerie Massillon is the fish store, the Cave Massillon is the wine store, and that one speaks for itself. Back to the statue of Massillon, perhaps you can see the steps behind him. If you take these steps and follow the street on up the hill that winds behind there, you will eventually come to 7 Rue Rabaton, which was the home where Massillon was born. There's a plaque outside that marks the home. If you knock on the door, and maybe you're not too sketchy looking, the woman who lives there may invite you in to see the room where he was born. Oh, by the way, that house has been continuously inhabited since at least 1663 when Massillon was born. Our hosts in Hyères were the members of the Historical and Archaeological Society. And we shared many meals together, really developing some nice friendships and acquaintanceships. And we pretty much toasted this friendship frequently. The mayor invited us to his chambers for a champagne reception. We met a number of people in local government, and we exchanged gifts from one another. The mayor has proposed a student exchange between our two cities, so it would be very nice if that project became a reality. Now, as I said, we were invited to here to help celebrate their, the 350th anniversary of the birth of Massillon. And the plans for that day were a number of speeches and so on about the life of Massillon, his childhood in here, his family, his theological training, his professional career, his life as a bishop, what life was like at the time, all sorts of things that reflected his life and told about his life. I was the last speaker of the day, and I told them about our project and introduced them to the city of Massillon, named for their favorite son. Among the pictures I showed them were a couple of places here in town named for Massillon, our museum and the library, pointing out that the wing on the right-hand side had originally been the home of Eliza Duncan, who named our city, Massillon. Of all the things that I told them about our city, I think the thing that seemed to surprise and not really amuse, but seemed the most striking was the fact that we have over 70 churches. In France, nearly all the churches are Roman Catholic, and a town the size of here might have anywhere from 6 to 10 churches, but they certainly wouldn't have 70, and they certainly wouldn't be of all different kinds of denominations. I showed pictures of our high school and, of course, the stadium. And because of a pageant that had been put on at St. Mary's Elementary shortly before we went to France, I could tell them that at least some young people in Massillon are familiar with Bishop Massillon. And perhaps you can even recognize Bishop Massillon there on the right-hand side. Our last day in here was spent at the Médiathèque, which is what the French now call their libraries. The director showed us around his building and then also pointed out a display about the life of Massillon, which they had prepared. Before we left the United States, we had become aware of an American military cemetery in the area, not too far from here, in the little town of Draguignan. When we learned there were 4 soldiers from Stark County buried there, we knew for sure we wanted to go. And this is where we made another Massillon connection. The woman in the center there in the middle, is the wife of the cemetery superintendent. They are both career military people. But her mother graduated from Washington High and now lives in Greens, so she periodically comes to Stark County to visit. This cemetery was established after Operation Dragoon in the south of France during World War II. Several weeks after the Allied invasion in Normandy in the north of France, the Allies staged another invasion in the south of France in an effort to keep pressure on the Nazis, forcing them back across the Rhine and into Germany. Of course, there were many casualties, and among the 4 from Stark County is Louis Billman from Massillon, and we took these flowers to place on his grave. Our book, our project, The Massillon Connection, of course, we have been attempting to show the connection between Jean-Baptiste Massillon, Eliza Duncan, and then leading on to the city of Massillon. But it's certainly been equally rewarding to make these connections with new friends, with new places, and with new information about our community. It's our hope that this book will enhance our heritage, our local history, and our pride in both Jean-Baptiste Massillon and our city of Massillon.
Thank you, Dr. Packley and Tricia. Clearly, one connection we don't have with Massillon is tropical temperatures. So I want to introduce our panelists to the stage, and they're all sitting down front, so as I start to announce your name and introduce your bio, if you want to take seats along here, and we'll begin our discussion. Our first is Terry Woods, who's a retired mechanical engineer and has authored a number of books about local canal history, including the Ohio and Erie Canal in Stark County and Ohio's Grand Canal, A Brief History of the Ohio and Erie Canal. Thank you, Terry. Andy Preston currently wears a number of hats, a summa cum laude graduate of University of Akron History MA program. Andy is an adjunct faculty member at Walsh University in North Canton. In the meantime, he also works as an insurance broker at Polaris Financial Group in Jefferson, Ohio. He resides in Jefferson with his wife Margaret and son Oliver. Deborah Moan Altimus is a volunteer with the Massillon Museum, and she has been a genealogy researcher for 37 years. Deborah. Dr. Douglas Palmer was recently appointed Vice President for Academic Affairs at Walsh University in North Canton. Welcome, Dr. Palmer. Katina Hazemihalis graduated with a dual degree in History and Museum Studies from Walsh University. In addition to her work on the Massillon Connection, she's provided research, drafting, and editing assistance for a number of book projects, and she currently resides in Cuyahoga Falls. Katina. Shane Jackson is the Chief Deputy Clerk of the Massillon Municipal Court, a former member of the Board of Directors for the Massillon Museum. He continues to serve as a trustee for the Golden Key Center for Exceptional Children. He's active in local and regional politics. Shane. Paul Rainier is a Massillon resident of French heritage and has taught English and literature and Latin on the high school level. Paul. Last and certainly not least, Reverend Thomas E. Blantz, a professor of history emeritus at the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. Blantz, who joined the Notre Dame faculty in 1968, is a Massillon native whose family was one of the city's early settlers. Reverend Blantz. So we're going to dive right in. And as I mentioned, we'll have Q&A at the end, so be thinking about those questions you're going to be asking. I'm going to start with Terry. Are you ready for me, Terry?
Yeah, I can turn this on. Does it work? Yes.
It sure does.
Okay.
Terry, why don't you tell us why the canal is important to Massillon?
Well, in the simplest sense, the decision by the Ohio Canal Commission in January of 1826 to route the Ohio Canal through Stark County down the east or left bank of the Tuscarawas River dictated the location of Massillon and its founding date. The location, of course, is here, just a few rods south of the state road that crossed the river about where Cherry Street is now. And the date was December 1826. But in a larger sense, the completion of the canal through Massillon for the first lock in August of 1828 tied Massillon north to Cleveland along the Ohio Canal, over Lake Erie to Buffalo, down the Erie Canal to Albany, and down the Hudson River to New York. And then in late 1832, when the canal was completed down to the junction of the Muskingum and Ohio rivers, it tied Massillon to the east through the Ohio River up to Pittsburgh and over the Pennsylvania Main Line Canal and railroad system to the Philadelphia area. So in effect, the Ohio Canal was the last step in uniting the frontier out here at the far edge of the country to the east. It united the two sections of our country economically and politically. For before these waterways were completed, the people out here in the frontier, our forebears, found it easier often to trade in the spring when the rivers were high down the Tuscarawas to the Muskingum to the Ohio, trade all along the Mississippi all the way down to New Orleans, which at that time was under control of a foreign power. Our leaders in the East, our federal government leaders, were fearful They were downright terrified where our economic ties were, our political ties might go too. So they were afraid that actually the Ohio Canal tied the two countries, the two parts of our country together.
Thanks so much, Terry. Andy, you probably have the most important question of the night. No pressure.
Yeah, that was a lot of pressure.
Why did Eliza Duncan name the town Massillon?
So my answer to this really important question of the night is, I can't be sure.
Next.
Yeah, right, yeah. There's, Charlie talked just a little bit earlier about how, we don't have a diary, we don't have some, kind of smoking gun type document that tells us so definitively, oh, she decided to name the town Massillon because this very thing or that very thing. We don't have that. So in the absence of that, we had to kind of work with what we did have, which was some information about her heritage, some information about basically her historical context and who she was as a person. When I first began considering this question, we looked at her heritage as being one possible motive for her decision to name the town Massillon. And after some help with some very, very great people at the Massillon Public Library and also with Deb Ultimus, we considered this her genealogy, traced it back. It turns out that her one of her side, the father's side of the family, goes all the way back to England. So this isn't France. This is England. The other side of her family, we're not quite sure about, but they were certainly in America for quite a while. So it doesn't really seem like heritage was the reason that she decided to name the town Massillon. What's more reasonable to assume is that Eliza, in virtue of who she was, a wealthy young woman in the early 19th century in America who was looking to find a place within the woman's sphere in America at this time. One of the things that would be helpful in her endeavor to do that would be to acquire certain, polish. One of the skills that she might acquire in attaining that polish was the ability to speak French. And so we kind of hypothesized that Eliza has come to name the town as a result of, her education and her particular historical context, which, made the idea that French was something that marriageable young ladies should know something about.
Thank you so much. Deborah, speaking of genealogy, what has happened to the Duncan family? Where are they today?
Well, after Eliza and James Duncan moved from Massillon, they went up to Michigan, and they went over to Illinois, and some of their daughters started to move to New York. Eliza, they have a daughter, Eliza, also. So Eliza and James had an Eliza V. She stayed in Chicago. Their eldest daughter, Mary, she's the one that moved over to Buffalo, New York first. And then her sister, Sarah, followed. She moved over to New York City. They married, they had children, and they just kept going and going. But they kept going back and forth from New York to Illinois to Michigan. And when James Duncan died, he was in Illinois at the time. He's buried there. Eliza, when he had died, she moved in with 3 of her daughters, first in Illinois, then in Michigan, ended up with her daughter Sarah in New York City, and that's where she died, and she's also buried there. Daughter Sarah closely followed. She died in New York, and she's also buried there. Daughter, let's see, Eliza. Now she moved over with Mary, her sister, in Pasadena, California. So we start to span East Coast to West Coast. And Mary also died in Pasadena. Now, this is the wonderful thing. Mary was a Reynolds, okay? Mary Duncan, she married James Reynolds. They have this huge monument with a bunches and bunches of names of all the family members, where they were born, where they died, their dates, and it's just like, whoever put this monument up, I love them. Because we found out so much from this. And we found out that the cousins today still talk to each other, and I made contact with a few of them by email, and we have all the way down to the births of 2013. So we are caught up, and they go from East Coast to West Coast, 13 of the 50 states. They even have descendants in Mexico and Canada. So Caroline was the very last to die in 1902 in New York. And they're just everywhere. It's wonderful.
Deborah, how many descendants approximately are alive today?
I would say about 50, and
And all connected.
they're all
for the most
connected.
part.
Yeah, and I'm hoping someday they come back here and just see what a wonderful town Massillon has become, and I think that would be wonderful. So there we go.
Thank you. Dr. Palmer, tell us a little more about Bishop Massillon, who he was, what he did.
Sure, thank you. We had a wonderful introduction to the biography, which I don't want to go over a second time. But Bishop Massillon might be the single most unlikely bishop in the history of certainly early modern France. Everything he had done in his career seems to resist this pull to becoming a bishop, and frankly, it's lucky that he didn't end up in jail. And let me explain what I mean by that. You know, so he thrives in the court of Louis XIV. Historians call this period in which Massillon lives the age of eloquence. And Louis XIV and the French kings try everything to show the glory of France, and that in fact France has a unique relationship, that the king was known as the most Christian king. And certainly the bishops and the preachers and the priests were meant to sort of mimic this. Most of the episcopal hierarchy would have been members of the nobility, and Massillon has very minor nobility, but certainly he's not from one of the great noble families. Early in his career, he actually tries to become a monk. He joins the Trappists, and he spends time with the Trappists. We know the Trappists today. They're very famous for their brewing, and somewhere in the room, maybe a future craft brewer, I think a Massillon Trappist ale would really be a moneymaker. And I'll be the first in line. But he's yanked out of the Trappists, and he's told that he's not allowed to pursue that route. He ends up becoming the rector of a seminary, and a seminary that was famous actually for some fairly radical and unorthodox ideas, but also ideas that were really certainly humble and more socially oriented. And yet, in spite of all of this, in 1717, he's appointed the Bishop of Clermont. And in spite of this path that he's taken, where he seems to want to resist the limelight, he ends up in a very important position in becoming one of the most famous court preachers of his day.
Wonderful. Thank you. Katina, tell us why Bishop Massillon was important.
Well, I think as Dr. Palmer kind of intimated, one of the reasons Massillon is very important is that he spoke some very kind of hard and progressive truths to very powerful people. But I think if we want to look at it in terms of why did he leave a legacy that persisted to Eliza Duncan's time and even to our own time today, I think it really boils down to the fact that Massillon's sermons were very accessible. At the height of his preaching, the Catholic Church was kind of hip deep in the Counter-Reformation, where they're trying to revisit and recapitulate their teachings in the wake of Protestantism. And as a result of that, a lot of the preaching at the time was concerned very much with matters of church dogma that to the average layperson would be very arcane, very obscure. And this was a time in French history where society is going through social, political, economic upheaval, and people are facing these very major practical issues in their day-to-day lives, and in the midst of all that, they're having a hard time seeing why they should care about these issues of dogma. So when Massillon came on the scene, I kind of see it as being similar to the way people have responded to Pope Francis today, where at a time when a lot of people were beginning to feel very alienated from the church, Massillon came out with a message that showed them, maybe there is still something here for me. Maybe the church still has relevance to my life. And he did that by really leaving dogma to the side. He preached sermons that touched on very just core foundational principles of Christianity. He talked about charity. He talked about loving your neighbor. And he did so with a very kind of keen grasp of psychology. He didn't just say, hey, love your neighbor because Jesus said that's the right thing to do. He said, love your neighbor because Jesus said that's the right thing to do. But when you don't act lovingly to your neighbor, here's why you're doing that. Here's how you're justifying that in your mind to yourself. And because he left dogma to the side, you really didn't have to be Catholic to find something in his sermons that resonated with you. Eliza Duncan herself, I believe, was not Catholic. And really, because he preached these kind of sermons about kind of day-to-day morality and day-to-day moral issues that anybody faces during their life, you really don't even have to be Christian to find something that speaks to you about these issues that he's talking about. You know, the moral issues that we all face are the same regardless of our religion or lack thereof, and the psychological reasons that we face those issues are the same. So kind of as long as you're a human being, you can find something in his sermons that speaks to you, I think.
Thanks, Katina. We mentioned earlier one of the more famous or well-known sermons of Bishop Massillon was on the fewness of the elect, or as Dr. Peckley mentioned, why so few will be saved. So Shane, tell us a little about this sermon.
Let us quickly set the stage. It is Septuagesima Sunday in 1704 France, the 9th Sunday before Easter. In the audience this day is Louis XIV, the Sun King, the absolute ruler of France. At the date of this sermon, King Louis has already reigned as king for 61 years. And it's not like being a monarch today where Queen Elizabeth may show up to cut the ribbon at a new soccer stadium. At this time, France was an absolute monarchy. The word of the king was law. Louis XIV was once famously quoted as saying, "It is legal because I wish it." Today's sermon on the fewness of the elect is being delivered by Jean-Baptiste Massillon. Massillon isn't a bishop yet. That appointment is about 10 years away. He is, however, a famous orator and preacher, like Charlie said, the Billy Graham of his day. And just as Billy Graham preached and counseled American presidents on matters spiritual, Jean-Baptiste Massillon preached to the kings of France. Massillon takes the opportunity with this sermon to make his audience think, to contemplate how many people are saved, and to get his audience, king included, to consider whether they are among these happy few who find salvation or the party of the unworthy who do not. To be saved, he would argue, we must be among the innocent or among the penitent. And as we were probably not among the innocent, the question becomes, are we truly penitent? And he will argue pretty persuasively that the majority of this audience in 1704, and quite honestly, most of those who read this sermon today, are not truly penitent, and that our salvation is far from guaranteed. Massillon imparts upon his audience what many would describe today as the fear of God. I have personally read this sermon over 100 times, and every time I read it, I question my own prospects for salvation. But this is what the sermon is meant to do, to encourage contemplation, not to give up hope, but to do better, to live better, to be better. This is not a sermon given to condemn his audience to an unhappy hereafter. It was meant to motivate his listeners to repent, to reform, and to strive to do better. What was not lost on Massillon that day was that King Louis was in the audience. And there is little doubt during the sermon, King Louis contemplated his own eternal fate. Years earlier, upon hearing Father Massillon preach, the king famously stated, "When I hear other preachers, I feel pleased with them. When I hear you, I feel displeased with myself. We can surmise that the sermon had an impact that day. We are also fairly certain its message has relevance, with us still today. Well, Massillon was a Catholic priest and later a Catholic bishop. Like Tina said, his exhortation to repent and to reform and to live a better life isn't a Catholic message, it's a universal message, one that is shared in many denominations of many faiths. And I am confident that should you all hopefully purchase a book here tonight and read the sermon, it will have an impact on you as well.
Repeated, but I think that just verifies the Latin dictum, repetitio est mater studiorum. Repetition is the mother of studies. So let's begin our study by observing the people of Massillon. And as we observe them, we may come to realize that very few know that our fair city was named after a French preacher, one of the most famous of the 1700s. In his day, he preached to commoners and royalty alike, including Kings Louis XIV and XV of France. In this sermon, he cried out loudly against evil wherever it be found. And he showed that the follies and the excesses that were prevalent in high society of his day, that was one of his main topics. As someone once said, there's no experience more, more awkward, but more universal than the stumble to the grave. In this sermon, he lists almost all the vices known to humanity as we stumble to the grave. As he says in the sermon, he shows that no man can consider himself to be fully innocent person. As he states in this sermon, you know you are a sinner, even though you're not sinning now. You know it because you sinned when you were younger. He then goes on to state that this slumber will at last fail. Stumbling will at last fail. And then he lists the fruit to be reaped from the sermon. And I strongly exhort all of you to reap the fruit by reading the sermon. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Reverend Lance, we'd love to hear your interpretation of this particular sermon.
I almost feel like this is a situation where everything has already been said, but not everyone has said it. So it's my turn now. I think there are always going to be mysteries, things we do not know and cannot understand in religion. Religion is a relationship between, I think, human beings and God, and as we try to understand this relationship, as we get closer to the God angle of this, there's going to be some things that we are not going to be able to understand. They're going to be a mystery. If we could understand everything, it would probably be just a purely human religion. And so I think there are things about religion and mystery and in religion that we're not going to know, and mysteries that are going to be there. And I think one of those, obviously, is how many people are actually going to be saved. It's not something any of us know for certain. The bishop does take the side that few are going to be saved, and he does give evidence for that, going through the Old Testament, the New Testament, etc., talking about Noah is one family that is still loyal to God, etc., of all the people at that particular time. And Noah and his family, they're going to be saved, and all the rest are going to be destroyed. That Abraham, of all the people at that time, Abraham is singled out to know the one true God, and that covenant made with him and his descendants, etc. And all the other people throughout the world are in the Middle East and Asia, Africa, China, every place else. They are not hearing about the one God, etc. And it continues this way, and even in the New Testament, that Christ coming on earth and preaching that relatively few people really followed him at all and accepted his teachings, and even when he is condemned to death, why there's very few people that are there with him at all, and none come to defend him and so on. And so he makes a good case, I suppose, that the good people are always a minority as he goes through the New and Old Testament. You've probably all heard the joke or story of the American bishop that was visiting one of the grade schools of his diocese, and he was going through it grade by grade by grade. It was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. He was down to the 4th grade and walking up and down the aisles and looking over the shoulders of the kids that were drawing, and he came to one little fellow, Billy, and he said, Billy, I couldn't understand. He said, Billy, what is that you're drawing this afternoon? And Billy said, I'm drawing a picture of God. And the bishop smiled and said, but no, Billy, nobody knows what God looks like. He said, well, they will when I get finished. It's true, we don't know what God looks like, and therefore that's why he sent his son, sent Christ into the world to show us who God really is. And I think Christ shows us that God is a God of mercy, a God of forgiveness, a God of patience, a God of love. And therefore, that in just looking at Jesus' actions in life in the New Testament, that saving the various people there, the parable of the Good Shepherd, leaving the 99 just to go after that one that is lost, etc. And the parable of the story of the sheep and the goats, there's no indication that the goats outnumber the sheep at all in that particular passage, etc. And the saving the paralytic, and the woman taken in adultery, and Zacchaeus, the greedy tax collector, and forgiving the apostles who fled on Holy Thursday night, and Peter who denied him 3 times, and Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, the executioner. So I think that it comes through that that God is primarily a God of love, a God of mercy, a God of salvation, suffering and dying for each one of us. And therefore, I'm not sure how God is going to save all of these people. It's one of those mysteries. I don't know that. It is a mystery, and I must say it's a mystery that I'm willing to live with.
Thank you, Reverend Blance. This is the point in the program where we invite any of you to ask a question of our panelists. I see John McGrath stepping to the microphone. John, are you ushering for it, or are you asking a question?
No, I'm just waiting for somebody to raise their hand.
All right, all right. I see a question in the middle here.
Can you go this way? Here you are.
This one's for Terry. You said that the canal system was built in about 1826, roughly. What was Robert Fulton's influence on those canals? Did he have any major part in it at all?
Robert Fulton, of course, Robert Fulton, of course, is known for a steam engine, and I didn't know you knew that he was very interested in canals. You're a very smart guy. I don't think he had too much to do with the Ohio system, except he did advocate canals at that time. A number of people were writing both for and against canals. You might remember that in 1825, when the Ohio Canal was begun, there was also something called the Baltimore-Ohio Railroad begun. So they were sort of simultaneous, even though at that time the Baltimore-Ohio Railroad was going to be a horse-drawn railway all the way from the East Coast to the Ohio River. And of course, by the time they finally got here, they got something called steam engines. But to answer your question, he was very instrumental in providing an interest in canals. How much he actually had to do with Ohio's canals is problematical. Thank you.
Thanks, Terry. Other questions from the audience? While people are getting brave, I'll ask a question, and I'm not sure if I should direct it to Tricia or Dr. Paclay. Obviously, Eliza Duncan was inspired by Bishop Massillon to name the town after him. Are we aware of any other towns named Massillon? Can someone pass the microphone?
The only other town is Massillon, Iowa. It's near Clinton, Iowa, just off of Route 30. It's a little bit smaller than Justice. You know where Justice is? Between Beach City and Brewster? It's just a little bit smaller than that. Originally, the town was called Benson's Crossing, but as I understand it, some people from Massillon moved out there and they just renamed the town.
So really, indirectly, still our Massillon.
We're the only one.
We're the only ones. Questions from the audience?
I have one for Tricia. I think Tricia would be the appropriate person. Do the French churches anymore go back to Massillon sermons? In other words, do they reprint those or discuss them actively? Or is he just revered as a historical figure?
I'm certainly not aware of anyone preaching his sermons today, and when I've attended church in France, the sermons are about as long as the first page of his sermon, so I don't think they'd ever go through the whole thing. And what was the second part of your question about? Oh, are his sermons available, or is he revered today?
Are the sermons popular in France? I mean, we revere him as a historical preacher, but do the sermons get replayed the way some of the classic Martin Luther King sermons, for example, are
I
often
don't think so.
repeated?
Would you, Father Blance? No. And some people know about him, of course, but I thought it was kind of interesting when we were corresponding with Claude Girard, the professor from the Sorbonne, and to do some research for us. He went to the priests at Notre Dame Cathedral and asked some of them about Massillon, what do you think of him? And one of the fellows was just really offended. One of the priests then said, he was practically a Protestant. He was just, he didn't even want to talk with him. He left.
Taking that question one step further, Reverend Lance, are Bishop Massillon's sermons studied in seminary or by ministers today, though?
I would think not. Just as maybe in church history or something, I'd just give it an indication of the culture and the church of the times. But no, I don't think anybody would. I mean, he certainly was a great orator. Bossuet and Bordeaux and the rest of Massillon are famous people in France who are preaching, and so you looked at him for that reason, but more of a historical.
Shane, you've got 100 reads on top of for the sermon, so you're way ahead of a lot of ministers already, right? We have a question from the audience.
Question? Yes.
Yeah, I heard a couple of comments about this, so I'm going to ask anyone with more than a touch of history, which names probably half the people on the panel. Concept of the elect, the name that comes to my mind is not the Bishop de Massillon, but John Calvin. Of course, John Calvin was a Catholic. His concept of the elect was different. This concept of the elect is different. On the other hand, my question is this. Knowing the French connection from the town south of here, I live in Navarre, having visited the cemetery outside of Mount Hope, which if you pronounce it correctly is Calmutière, and in Massillon it is not the Dutton agency, it's the Touton. Great French influence, Paquelin. Given, and I heard this mentioned, that these people up here were not Catholic, they were Protestant. And yet there is this drawing towards French stuff. Given the fact that she named the place out of a French bishop's name, does that tell us how much they knew about French culture or how little? That's my question.
Andy, do you want to take this?
About that. So the first part of your question, as I understand, is just about an attraction to French culture, or why is this Episcopalian woman attracted to this French bishop from a century removed from her. One of the things that I was interested to find in my research, I tracked down the likelihood of whether or not Eliza would have been able to get her hands on French copies of Massillon's sermons in America. She would have fairly easily. And she would also have been able to get her hands on some English copies as well. and looking through, some of the newspaper advertisements for these books, sermons of J.B. Massillon, they would always have little plugs, or some of them would have little plugs and, little explanations. Oh, the bishop who spoke to the heart, someone who, and these were, American newspapers, and they touted him as someone who was just so stirring, and his prose was so lively and so touching, and one of the terms that comes to mind is, so painful, something that speaks to you on a deep level. This is one reason that I can hypothesize that there was an attraction there, even though she was not exactly a Catholic herself.
Let's take one more question.
Curious about that, if there was any connection to the Duncan jeweler family in town, to the Duncans.
Terry, would you like to take that?
I believe there is a distant relation there, yes. It's the best I can do. I've gone through a lot of clipping files in the Massillon Museum, and I think I remember seeing something where he is a distant cousin of some way.
Deborah, anything else you know on that? No. Well, we want to thank everyone for coming out this evening and taking part in the celebration of our book launch. We want to take a moment especially to give our heartfelt thanks to Dr. Packley, who really was the champion of our we're all going to enjoy this as we read through it. As a reminder, our panelists will be outside in the lobby to sign your copy of the book. Thank you so much and take care.